Yeah, welcome, David, to this conversation on you and Methodism. Could you just start by giving us a little background on who you are and your family history with the Methodist Conference in Arkansas?
Yes, I'm David Freeman, and my history goes deep into my family. I mean, that's the case for a lot of people, especially a lot of pastors. It seems to be one of those callings that gets passed down through families. But my family history goes back to the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, where my great-great-grandfather was a pastor in Arkansas, mostly in the southern part of the state. His name was Horace Jewell. And he served a lot of churches down around Hope. That was kind of where our family's home base was for a long, long time. But he actually wrote the very first history of Methodism in Arkansas. That's the title of the book. It's called History of Methodism in Arkansas. And there are a few copies of that book floating around. I have a copy. My sister has a copy. I think my grandmother still has a copy. So they're pretty coveted in our family for that. But he was also the pastor of First United Methodist Church of Little Rock, where I currently serve. I guess it was actually the Methodist Episcopal South when he served it. And so he served it in the 1880s for about 4 years. And so there was a rich history of my family in the church that I'm currently serving. And so I had Methodism on both sides of my family. My father's family were Methodists in Dumas, Arkansas. And so when my parents married in the 60s, it was just a convergence of Methodism. And so another piece of that is my grandparents, my mom's parents, met at the Wesley Foundation at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville when they were in college, and started courting. I think that's how you said it at that time. And they got married and moved to Little Rock after college. My grandmother got a job at First Methodist Church at that point as I believe it was like director of ministries was kind of the title, but she kind of did everything for the church. The funny thing was my grandfather, whose grandfather was the one who had been the pastor of that church, he actually wanted to go to Pulaski Heights Methodist because one of his friends was the associate pastor at Pulaski Heights. And so he thought that's where they were going to go to church. But my grandmother got a job and said, "Oh no, this is the church we're going to go to." So that's how my more immediate family got connected to First United Methodist Church of Little Rock. So my grandparents were married in this church. So I guess when they got that job, they weren't married yet. When my grandmother got that job, they weren't married yet. They did get married. And then they raised all of their kids in the church. And so when my parents got married and were living in Little Rock, and my sister and I came along, we were both raised in this church, baptized here, and came up through children's programs and youth ministry. And both my sister and I experienced our own calls to ministry through that connection. And so my connection to Methodism in Arkansas really drills down into First United Methodist Church of Little Rock in a deep way. That it's kind of, we're kind of tethered to this church, even though I've served other churches and been in other community faiths and other connections. It's still tied very deeply to my roots.
So then, was there anyone here at First Methodist Little Rock who was an inspirational figure to you, where you're like, they said, "David, this is the career path for you," or was that just something you stumbled into on your own?
Yes, to both of those. My call to ministry is really tied to my sister's call to ministry in many ways. My sister, whose name is Emily Freeman, it's now Emily Freeman Penfield. She is 3 years older than me, and we were very much a part of this church's youth ministry for a long time, even before we were youths. My mom was a volunteer with the youth ministry, and so we spent a lot of time at the church working with the youth. And when I was in junior high, my sister was in high school. The youth minister's name was Margaret Davis, and she actually, during that time, she married our second cousin, so she became Margaret Davis Freeman. So you can see all the inbreeding that's happening here in a good way. But Margaret was very instrumental in that early part of my calling, but really my sister's calling, and kind of identified that in Emily. Margaret at the time was a diaconal minister, and then later was ordained as a deacon. But she was I think the first to kind of say to both of us, I see something beyond. I see a lifetime of this for you all. She didn't identify, it was going to be this direct path, but I kind of see God calling you all in different ways. And so she was very instrumental in my sister's. My calling kind of came a little bit later as I grew and matured, but the fact that I had seen my sister forge this path helped me identify exactly what was going on. Like, I'm having these feelings, this kind of tug, this pull towards a lifetime of ministry, of kind of professional ministry, if you will. So I was able to kind of articulate it better watching my sister go through it. So I would say Margaret and my sister were pretty influential in that way. After my sister left for college, and Margaret had moved away, Ed Matthews was the pastor here. And I think Ed was the first person I ever said directly to, like, there's something going on in me, and it's this pull towards something, and we had a conversation, with several conversations, to articulate this as what it means to be called by God, what it means to be called into ministry, and so I kind of credit Ed with helping really give words to that beyond just this internal thing that was bubbling up in me, this kind of God's movement in that. Also, the youth director at the time, his name was Greg Gibson. He was very important to me, and he came along and nurtured that in me, really nurtured the leadership piece in me, gave me a lot of opportunities to lead in the church and try things out. And so those were the people I would say were really influential early on. And I'm grateful that they were patient, because, I was a high school kid. And so it wasn't all, the most mature expressions of all those things. So especially, getting opportunities to preach when I was in high school. Like, I look back, and I think everybody does this, and they look back at their early sermons and they just cringe. But the fact that the church was, specifically Ed and Greg and the entire church, was so gracious about it. And as bad as it was, they were so affirming, and they could look past the surface to see there may be something deeper.
I've discovered there's a lot of patience among the congregation here, because Jonathan and I have done a lot of painful music things, and people, they're very polite, very patient through those early growing pains. Yeah. So it's a good community to be supported in.
It is. It's a community that really values young people, from whatever college, high school on down, to, as you say, be patient and say, it may not be the smoothest path, but we're going to continue to nurture that. And they really invest in people. Mm-hmm.
So did you follow in your sister's footsteps and go to the same seminary, same schools and all that, or did you take a different path?
Yeah, my sister and I have identical educations. After high school, she went to Centenary College in Shreveport, Louisiana, which I always describe as the Hendrix of Louisiana. It's the small liberal arts Methodist college of Louisiana. And so 3 years later, I went there. I didn't go specifically because she was there, but I was, I knew about it. I was really familiar with it. I had gone to visit her several times. And they had a program there. They had first of all, they had their religion department was really healthy at the time, and it had actually a degree in religious education, which I was really interested in at the time. That's what my sister was majoring in, and so I wanted that. And then they had a professional development program called, at the time it was called the Centenary School of Church Careers, and it was for people who were experiencing a call into ministry, and it was kind of an extra part of that. So that was what drew me to Centenary, but my sister had gone that. She actually went directly from college to seminary, and she went to Candler School of Theology at Emory. So she went straight through. I also went to Candler, but I spent 4 years in between college and seminary working as a youth director at First United Methodist Church of Little Rock. So, again, I was tethered and pulled back to that. But that was a really good opportunity for me to really grow up and mature. I don't think I was headed straight to seminary, and this opportunity came up to be the director of youth ministries at First Church Little Rock. And I took it, and I just, it was a great time for me to grow up and learn what it meant to have a job and how to pay bills and mature a little bit. And I think I was a better student because of that. I wasn't the greatest student like my sister. My sister was a good student. I wasn't a great student, but once I got to seminary, it kind of all clicked, and I became a better student because of it. So yeah, we have identical educations in that way. And so, yes, she was literally forging a path for me. I just took a little bit longer to do it.
Do you ever feel like you are having to constantly live up to expectations, since you have such a long history here at First Methodist, as one being, your family here, and then following in the footsteps of these mentors in the youth department, and then following Ed Matthews several decades later as the senior minister? Do you ever feel like you have to live up to these expectations?
Yes, I do. For one, I'm a pathological people pleaser. That's my Achilles heel, is I always want to make people happy. And so there is this kind of living up to people's expectations anyway. But then when there are all these people that I'm following that I've held with such high regard, who have been so influential in me, there is this kind of internal drive to do that. But there's external pressures as well. When the bishop first appointed me to First Church Little Rock, before I even arrived, I could just feel the pressure mounting, the way people reacted to it, even my own family. The day it was announced, I got an email from a second cousin that said, there's rejoicing in heaven over this appointment. And I was like, hold on, this doesn't have eternal consequences here. And the church was in a time of a little bit of turmoil, mostly just financial strain at the time. And so there was this feeling that it needed fixing. That was what was continually communicated to me. And I kept feeling like the pedestal that I'd been put on was getting taller and taller. And I was trying to be very deliberate to get off that pedestal for my own safety, because the only way off a pedestal is down. And so I was like, no one works really hard to keep you up there. You fall off. And so what I wanted to do was not just lower expectations, but make all expectations a reality, and invite people into making their own community faith healthier, not just like, oh, I could come in and fix it all, but let's fix this together. And so I try to be deliberate about that. But yeah, there was a lot of expectations with that. Still are for some, in some ways.
Mm-hmm. So then what do you think are some of the most important attributes of a well-rounded minister, whether it's at a small church in rural Arkansas or a big one here in Little Rock?
They're the obvious, a deep abiding faith, an understanding of a lived grace. We can talk about grace, we can talk about God's grace, but how are we living into that grace ourselves? And how are we expressing that grace? Those are kind of things I would say, are obvious. Maybe obvious isn't the obvious word. I would say the other is the others that are less spiritual would be a strong self-differentiation, that we differentiate ourselves from our church, that the success of the church isn't our success, that the failures of the church aren't our failures, and that we can differentiate between ourselves and the community of faith. That's not to say that we aren't a part of the community of faith, that we aren't deeply a part of it, but it isn't our full selves. And I do believe that pastors should fully engage in the lives of the people. There are I think that I've seen pastors who aren't, that it's kind of like, this is my job, and I'm going to be disconnected from that. I do think we're a part of the lives, but you do have to self-differentiate from that, because sometimes we can get ego can drive more of it. And so I think some self-differentiation from that is a good attribute. As I said, a sense of grace, that really all we're trying to do is make God's grace real and tangible in people's lives. And so having our own connection to that grace, our own experience of that grace is really important. And I think it's also a pastor's job, whether, like you said, whether a very small church or a large church or everything in between, is to have their eyes on the larger community, that we don't exist in a vacuum, that the church is there for the transformation of the world, not just its own self-interests. Or its own self-perpetuation. And so it's the pastor's responsibility to look outside the walls. So yeah, that would be an attribute to that.
What are some of the difficulties of running a church, the day-to-day difficulties that you encounter?
People management is probably the hardest thing anybody does. When you think about, in the business world, they talk about soft skills and hard skills. Soft skills are the kind of the people skills, and the hard skills are like the financial decisions and being able to administrate well. I actually think that those titles are misnomers. I think hard skills are actually easier than the soft skills, because you're dealing with people, and people deal with emotions, and there's no way to disconnect from that. And so people management, whether that's staff or lay people, that's a hard thing to do, especially for somebody, like I said, as a pathological people pleaser. I'm constantly bumping up against my own anxieties of what it means to direct and lead. I think that some of the other challenges are are actually external pressures. So the the value in religious life is waning in our culture, and it has been for decades. So when it was waning before we realized it was waning, and that makes it harder. So that you have less marginal time in people's lives. It used to be that when somebody moved to town, they joined the first whatever denomination they were a part of, and they made that a weekly practice that you go to church, you're involved in your church life, and church was the center of people's social lives, or at least it was at least near the center of their lives. It's now, pushed to the margins of that, and there's this other piece that's the center of their lives, and so church gets marginal time in their lives, and that's a big challenge, because what we're trying to do is help them have a faith experience that directs their whole lives. And how do you do that with something that's just a side piece of their understanding? And I'm not saying that to criticize anybody or to pass judgment on that. It's the reality for a lot of people, but it makes it more challenging, and so you're kind of battling against that, and you're battling against, like, how much are we imposing on people's lives, and then how much are we saying, look, this is important. This has deep. This is about connecting to something more than just the activity of her life or whatnot. I've often described it. We talk about it a lot at First United Methodist Church of Little Rock, but we kind of construct our lives as if we're building a brick wall, and we have our home brick and our work brick and our social brick and our civic understanding brick, our political, all this, and we're kind of building this. And unfortunately, we've made our faith just a brick, just a piece of that, and we call it church, and so our connection to Jesus Christ is that brick, and it's just over here, but there's all these other important bricks. Whereas I would like to change that, and that our faith in Christ is the mortar that holds all the other bricks together. And it's not, you can still have your church brick, but that church brick is informing all of the mortar that's holding all the pieces together. So helping people understand that is a challenge, to having the church really form meaning in people's lives, not just fill their lives with activity, but really help them form meaning that is connected to the divine.
So as you think about this, as you say, the waning attendance, the waning interest in religious life, the pandemic only accelerated that trend.
Yeah, fed it steroids.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a distressing thing to witness as the minister of a church. Where do you see, not just First Methodist Little Rock, but the Methodist denomination, as we come to this big split between the Global Methodists and the United Methodists, with the waning attendance, the decline in that, where do you see the path forward, and where do you see the church in 10 years or 20 years?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think I will say this. I think the waning value of religion, and it's not just Methodism or Christianity even. I think it's the waning importance of spirit in people's lives. I think it's a symptom, really, of the kind of every institution of this world is deteriorating or crumbling in many ways. We're seeing kind of an assault on every institution. And I'm talking like kind of meta institutions, like the institution of truth. Like, I mean, there's like argument of what is true anymore. But it's everything, it's the institution of marriage, the institution of government, the institution, but then it's also, actual institutions within that kind of framework. And so it's not this, it's not like, oh, religion has failed, Christianity has failed, Methodism has failed, or anything like that to cause this decline. It's just a product of the dissolving of institutionalism, and that creates and when people's lives, when the foundations, these foundational institutions of people's lives are more like shifting sand, it causes a great deal of fear in people's lives. That wasn't directly what your question was, but it kind of leads us next to, I think, not just Methodism, but all mainline denominations. I think even non-denominational churches that have been heralded as like the future of Christianity. I actually think they're even on shiftier ground than mainline denominations. But I think church in general is going to look smaller, and it needs to. I think we need to go to more, almost like a house church mentality. That's not to say that we don't have the central gathering places or the large congregational pieces, but true connection has to be smaller. And that means that churches, individual churches, are going to have to learn to do ministry with less resources. And I'm not just talking about money or even people, but again, less marginal time in people's lives, less influence on life, less influence in the community, and things like that. I think that true connection to God through community is going to take place more outside of church walls. I think that I see it happening on hiking trails. I see it happening in different community service organizations. I see it happening in bars and restaurants more than I see it happening in Sunday school classrooms and fellowship halls and family life centers and even sanctuaries. And it leaves a lot of churches saying, what do we do with this facility that we've built and called the center of our lives? I think that was one of the things that the pandemic really shone a light on, was, church is a lot more mobile than we thought. Now, that sustained mobility we also realized is unsustainable in people's lives, and when people were not, when people didn't have the opportunity to come together, they drifted apart even further. And so that's why I say there still is a great value on communal connection. So I could see 10, 20 years, some models where every Sunday, several Sundays a month, a group of 5 to 10 people meet in a home to watch church together, to watch an online version of church together. And then, every so often that the full church comes together, things like that. I also think that that the pace of our culture is unsustainable, and that people are living the most exhausted lives ever. And they're filling their lives with more and more. And I think that where church can really show up is how to teach them to rest. And I don't mean just like collapse and take a nap, but how do you slow your life down? How do you discover what is most central, and what is it in your life that can help you have a spiritual experience, meaning how can you connect with God? How can you unite your soul with God, God incarnate? And so I think that, I don't know what that really looks like, but I do think that it may not look like work as hard as you can through the week, collapse on the weekend, go to church and refill the bucket, and then go back to work and empty your bucket. I think it's going to have to be, the church is going to have to where people may find a real connection in the churches. This is the place that helps me walk at a different pace.
So then in your vision of kind of how there's smaller units of people, what happens to a building like this? I mean, we're sitting in an empty former Sunday school class as it is right now.
Right.
What do we do with this albatross around our neck, essentially, as Sunday school classes that have been meeting for 40, 50 years die out and create another empty room?
Yeah.
What do we do with this space?
It's a great question. That's the question. I think that's the question almost every church is facing.
It's going to be asked Quapaw, St. James, Pulaski Heights. They're in the same boat as us, I think.
Everybody, yeah. And you know, even you could say that in a city like Little Rock that has a bunch of churches, but think about it in a very small rural area where that church has, where the community has dwindled, the population has dwindled, and a church is down to 10, 6 people, but yet you still are maintaining this building. That's going to be a big question. And again, the pandemic was like, you know, the light of the sun shining on that. I've read the Bible a few times. Nowhere in the Bible, especially the Gospels, does Jesus say, build a giant edifice, also put in priceless works of art called stained glass windows, and then maintain that building in perpetuity. And that is the center of your faith. Nowhere. And so when it comes to something like that, which is a big challenge for First United Methodist Church of Little Rock, where, you know, our building, our sanctuary is 120 years old. And we have things like our airflow system was built in the 30s. Like, you know, this upkeep is just, you know, taking a lot of the resources. And those are resources that then aren't available for mission and ministry. And there's a tension in that. But at the same time, as I say that, I walk into a sanctuary, any sanctuary, but the sanctuary of First Church Little Rock, and you know that it's holy ground. You know, the way that they're designed, the way that they're created, are to bring you into a different space that opens up your soul to see God's, you know, to see God's presence, to feel God's presence. And so there's great value in that. And so I don't want to say, well, then we shouldn't have church buildings, because I don't want to go into that either, because I think there's value in that. But you do have these big buildings that are used, you know, not even 10% of the week. I think that we have to get creative of it, make it available to the community. I think that, you know, there are nonprofits out there that would love cheaper office space. There are artist communities that would want to use space. There are, organizations that can utilize that space if the church is willing to have the patience to deal with things that don't seem churchy or the bullseye of their mission. I think opening up your space and making it available is good. You know, this is a tangent, and I apologize, but there's a great book called Sanctuary, and it's about the church Central Methodist congregation in Cape Town. I'm sorry, Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, and they were seeing this huge influx of refugees. And the pastor made the church available for refugees to live. And the more came in, the more word was being spread, and people were coming just directly to the church, to a point where the entire building was overtaken by thousands of people. And they were living there, and the building was overrun. I mean, they were cooking over campfires in the hallways, and they just took over the church. And there's this tension, because in one way, it was super missional. It was like, well, yeah, that's what you do with the church. It's a place of safety. It's a sanctuary for people who have no home. You welcome the stranger, you know. But at the same time, that building was utterly destroyed. And they ended up having to like forcibly remove people from the space, because it could no longer function as a worshiping community, and it destroyed this resource in a way. And so the book doesn't have any sort of like. And I visited this church, and touring it, I felt that tension, because there's no resolution to that. There's no like, well, this was the right answer. That's a tangent to say. I'm not saying like every church should just throw open their doors and make it a shelter, especially an unsafe shelter. But we have to raise our tolerance level of how a building is maintained and treated in order to make it a resource that's beyond ourselves. And I think that is the heart of the gospel, because it's this idea that well, I mean, it's death and resurrection, right? It's the temple, which, as Jesus says, is us. This is our temple, to allow to die in order to find life, and we have to. What we have to hold is the hope of that over what might be lost in it. And that was a huge tangent, and so y'all can chop all that out.
No, it's good, because it relates to the struggle of what a lot of churches are going to have to face.
Yeah. Yes, and because we build these churches and we think that's here to serve us, and that's not it at all. And I think that's some of the tension that's happening as churches are disaffiliating and going to different denominations or to the Global Methodist Church, is like, whose property is that? And it's why I think the trust clause is a good thing, because what the trust clause does is it says to that community over and over, this isn't really yours, it's God's. You just hold it in trust. Now there's the legal portion of that, like what is it? Who really is the legal agent or owner of property? But when you hold it in trust, that's a faith issue, and it's to say, you know, these resources, this building, these endowments, this organization was a gift to you, especially an old historic church. And I'm not talking about an old historic building. I'm talking about an old historic church. Like First United Methodist Church of Little Rock is older than the state of Arkansas. So how can you claim this is my church? Like everything that you have in this organization was a gift to you from people before you. That's the great cloud of witnesses.
And that's, as someone who's not terribly religious at all, that's more in line of where I come, that connection to the past, those people who have come and, we're standing on their shoulders.
Right. We are just the stewards of it right now.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you want to be remembered?
That was on the list of questions you gave me, and I was like, I'm going to skip that one.
Tough.
I'll say this. I've identified my core values, my central values as grace, connection, and humor. And humor is a strange one, I know, for a lot of people, but I do think that humor allows us to experience the joy of life, the almost the frivolity of life, and to not take everything so seriously. And so I like to live into that value of humor. So I that's a value for me. I want to be, and so I also want to be remembered as one who connected people, that drew people together and allowed them to see the divine love that happens through human love, through human connection. And so I want to be remembered as somebody who made connection possible. And I want to be remembered as somebody who was graceful. And I don't mean graceful as fluid. I mean like filled with grace, that even in disagreement, even in tension, that love was not spared in it. And that we may not, it's Wesley's, we may not believe alike, but let us love alike. And so I want to be remembered as somebody who was filled with grace.
Do you have any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to put out there?
No. I would just add that that I think sometimes I get painted as a cynic, as somebody who is anti-institution, or maybe even a little snarky. And the truth is, I really believe in the church, not as an institution, but as an expression of God's grace. And I believe that community is the center. I can't separate Christology and ecclesiology. I can't separate my understanding of Christ outside of the body of Christ. And so I do deeply believe in church as community and the body of Christ, the living body of Christ in this world. And so I guess that would go back to your last question of how I want to be remembered as one who helped build the body of Christ, not necessarily perpetuate the institution of the church.
Well, David, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.